I declare the meeting open. All very welcome along to Department or Committee for Communities this morning. In the room with me this morning I have Ciara Ferguson, Andy Allen, Stephen Dunn, Paul Free, Vice Chair Kelly Armstrong and Mark Durkin. No one else is on Starleaf at the moment, so we're fine there as well. Okay, then can I go to agenda item 1, which is declaration of interests. Remind members there are requirements, so we can go ahead, Andy.
Private sector landlord, Chair.
Paul.
Just declare an interest as an owner of a rented property.
And Stephen.
Same, Chair, private landlord.
Good stuff, thank you. We'll move on to agenda item 2, which is apologies. Any apologies? Nothing? Okay. All right, we're going to move on to agenda item 3, which is minutes. You'll find the minutes of the 2nd of November 2021 at page 6 of your meeting pack. Can I ask members, are you content to agree the minutes as drafted?
Agreed.
Agreed? Okay. We'll move on then to agenda item 4. Sorry.
Could you just read the bit, members as you...
Where are we? Sorry, bear with me. Oh, I missed that bit. Sorry. Sorry. I was wondering where it was. Members, as you know, the meeting today is to continue to take evidence on the private tenancies bill. However, there is one matter concerning the betting, gaming, lotteries and amusements amendment bill that I'd like to quickly cover. As we will not be in a position to start to take oral evidence sessions on the bill until December, I propose that we extend our call for evidence. The closing date was the 12th of November. I propose we extend it to the 26th of November to get as much evidence in as we can. Members agreed?
Agreed.
Yeah. Good stuff. All right, thank you. Okay, we'll move then on to agenda item 4, which is private tenancies bill papers. Members have been provided at page 11 with a departmental reply to queries raised during the second stage debate. Again, members wish to raise any points at this stage about the response? Are content at present? We'll move on. Yep, okay.
Present, yeah.
You've also been provided at page 21 with a reply from the Department for the Economy on queries on the progress of the energy strategy for Northern Ireland. A working group has been set up, including representatives from a number of departments and public sector organisations. The group will consider how best to drive compliance and standards across different building and tenure types, and how metrics such as energy performance certificates can be used to drive the improvements required. Again, members, any comments? Are you content to note this? Go ahead, Kelly.
Could we make a formal request back to the Economy Committee to ask that they specifically include private rented premises in this, given light of this, because we may not have the standards included, but if they include some sort of detail, then the Minister can include that in the regulations going forward.
Okay, no, we can ask that, certainly. Any other comment or content to note? Content? Okay, we'll move on then. You've been provided at page 23 with a reply from the Chartered Institute for Housing on the training it provides for letting and managing residential properties. Again, any comments or content to note? Content?
Yeah.
Or Kelly, do you want to make
I
comment?
was just going to say, it doesn't give a price on that, so I know that they say the option of free Chartered Institute membership is provided during the study, but it doesn't provide us with a price on that, just to give a comparator.
Bear with me one moment, sorry, Janice.
The detail they've given us was what he said he could provide us under his business, confidentiality and commercial sensitivity. So it may be that the cost falls under that, but we can always ask.
I was just thinking, because we had said that we wanted to know what was the content of that. I'd heard from other landlords to say that this was a very good training programme, but I'd be reluctant to make it mandatory if it was cost exclusive, but we don't know how much it costs. So.
We can try and find that out.
All right, okay. Members happy enough to move on from that, yeah? Okay, then we're going to move to agenda item 5, which is a property pal briefing on the private tenancies bill. Members, you'll find this briefing paper at page 28 of your pack, and then can I welcome Jordan Buchanan to the meeting. Jordan, you're very welcome. It's good to see you again. If you want to go ahead and give your presentation.
Thank you very much, Chair. Yes, thank you very much for the introduction to speak to you today on the bill. I just have some introductory remarks, and then I'm going to kind of go through each of the clauses and give some of the comments I feel fit, and then hopefully we can have some questions at the end if that works okay.
Yep, go ahead.
In terms of Property Pal, just this very brief introduction for those of you who aren't aware, it's the largest listings portal in Northern Ireland with 100% of estate agents and letting agents advertising their properties. That gives us a very unique understanding of the underlying housing market dynamics, and that's largely my remit, is to try and understand that and the dynamics of across the housing market. Now, to go straight into it, the immediate impacts of COVID-19 have clearly had a profound impact on all households, but increasingly the evidence suggests us that particularly low to mid-income households, many of whom who are in the PRS, have been increasingly hit by the financial pressures as a result of COVID. The PRS as a whole has grown considerably over the last decade, and we're forecasting it to continue to do so. New evidence from an English housing survey suggests that around 7% of private tenants are currently in arrears, with a further 9% likely to fall further behind in payments over the coming 3 months, which suggests the underlying concerns that are bubbling beneath the surface in the private rented sector. Since COVID-19 hit, overall rent levels in Northern Ireland have accelerated to 5.5%, albeit there is underlying differences there, whereby houses are now growing at 6.4% annual growth in rents versus 3.7% for apartments, perhaps reflecting the new demand patterns. However, it's also worth making reference that the growth in rents hasn't been consistent across Northern Ireland. Ards and North Down, for example, are seeing rents growing at 14% year on year, whereas the likes of Fermanagh and Omagh are seeing rents falling by 1.9%. So I just think it's very important at the outset that I address that point and make the committee aware that it's not a universal growth in rents across Northern Ireland. There are rental pressures in some areas more so than others. Nonetheless, rental demand at the minute does continue to remain exceptionally high. For example, we're currently getting 52 inquiries for every rental property we put up. That's around double the pre-pandemic average. But the most important point that I want to stress about the current dynamics in the rental market, there simply isn't enough properties coming to the market and enough stock there. We've added 4,000 fewer properties to the rental market this year, which is down around 22% compared to 2019 levels. So there is this real shortage against that heightened demand, which is really leading to those rising rent pressures. One of the features which our research suggests is because simply a lot of landlords are selling up and they're availing of the stronger market conditions, and we estimate around sort of 6% or so of properties which were previously on the rental market have since transitioned and have been sold on the open sales market. Now, kind of the central tenet of why I'm giving you this sort of introductory remark is ultimately what we need to be concerned about is any additional regulations which would further detract landlords from being in the sector, because we clearly have a shortage of properties. And we don't want to get into a position where we have any unintended consequences, which leads to a further exodus of those landlords. Now, we speak to letting agents almost on a daily basis, but we also speak more so to the public. So we get a really rich understanding of kind of the principles from both perspectives. And my view, certainly on the bill that's been introduced thus far, is it's very welcome and it's a really positive step forward, certainly in improving protections for the tenants. And my understanding is that as the general objectives, it's for good quality, secure tenancy, which will ultimately prevent sudden rent increases. And I do feel that's largely addressed by the bill. But to go into the specific clause points I have in the bill, and I haven't given evidence on every clause, or some of it I feel wouldn't be as applicable. I feel like I would be qualified to give a perspective on it. But with the pack that I provided, I have given on several clauses, but also given you sort of a deck of economic evidence there, which gives landlords perspectives on some of the underlying economic measures which are introduced in the rental market at the minute. Now, on clause 3 specifically, whether the tenant is to be provided with a written receipt for payment in cash, I think that needs to be amended to make sure it covers all payments from landlord to tenant, including non-rental payments. So, for instance, if the landlord were to just give a bill to the tenant and say a generic repairs for £250, that needs to be itemised with how they got to that bill for the repairs and a receipt given to the tenant for that payment. I also strongly believe a receipt should be issued at the time of payment and not thereafter. Like every consumer transaction, you would expect a receipt at the time. And this may be a bit of a pedantic point, but I just wanted to make sure there was a clear understanding there of what actually is a receipt, and do we need to have any sort of introduction, such as whether a digital receipt is acceptable, such as an email acknowledgement of payment, a signed letter to the property address, or even simple things like a WhatsApp message. Just a wee bit further understanding and clarity there might be useful. On clause 4, in particular, the limit on tenancy deposit amount, again, I fully agree with this principle, and a similar provision should be introduced for rent paid in advance, and the combination of those two features will go a long way in alleviating some of the upfront affordabilities, pressures at the commencement of any tenancy. In terms of Clause 7, to introduce legislation to stipulate that rents can only be increased once in a 12-month period. Firstly, from a high-level perspective, and certainly from what we see in our data sets and our understanding, is this isn't a significant concern for those who take sort of your typical 12-month tenancy agreements, that it would be less common to have that introduced sort of in the middle of it. But one of the questions I did have was a bit more clear of an understanding was, is this specific to a calendar 12-month period or a tenancy 12-month period, irrespective of who the current tenant is? Because, for example, say we have a 12-month tenancy and then by mutual agreement the tenant and the landlord continue to have a rolling monthly contract. At that stage, does that move into the next 12-month period where if the landlord were to increase the rent, they can't then do it with any of the subsequent monthly rents? Or do they need to be in some sort of a fixed tenancy period? So, for instance, almost like a mortgage agreement where you know your fixed tenancy or your fixed rent payment every month for that 12-month period, and then should you go into a next sort of rolling monthly arrangement? I believe written notice should be given to agreed changes in rent levels with a minimum of 3 months' notice, certainly in the cases of tenancies where they are 12 months or longer. A shorter notice period could be applicable if it was a shorter term let. Now, as a general sort of point of caution on this, and I think one of the other submissions had suggested this as well, whenever you highlight to landlords that they're allowed to raise rent every 12 months, it actually can be a behavioural change to encourage them to do so, whereas again, what would be relatively common practice is a lot of landlords who maybe don't increase every 12 months. It could go on for a couple of years before they would increase the rents. And one thing I've suggested, and I don't fully know how this could be implemented, but I wanted to put it to the committee's awareness, is could you introduce a provision to introduce a mechanism to allow tenants and or landlords to justify any changes in the rent? So, for instance, if the landlord did incur significantly higher mortgage costs as a result of rising interest rates over the next sort of 2 to 3 years, could they then provide comparable market rent analysis to suggest that is an appropriate value for rent based on the changed market conditions, and the same principle in reverse for tenants? And then, generally speaking, a broader point around caution on how you word the exemptions around renovation and refurbishments and alterations and extensions. That struck me initially as that could be a loophole which could be exploited, and it's really how can you quantify what is a significant investment in the property, rather than a sort of a minor cosmetic change which will allow the rent to be changed. In terms of Clause 8, to introduce legislation as soon as practical for mandatory requirement around smoke and carbon monoxide detectors. Again, that's a no-brainer. That should absolutely be introduced, and the tenant should be provided with guidance of how to operate and check, and to make sure they're working before any initial payment is made. In terms of Clause 9, I know this is for the second stage of the bill, but I thought it was useful again at this stage to bring it to the committee's awareness, because I've been doing some research on this around the introduction of EPC legislation to improve the EPC rating to C level. In terms of, I took a sample of around 10,000 properties advertised during 2021 in the private rented sector in Northern Ireland, and a stark 48% of those rental properties were below EPC level C, which is a huge figure, and highlights the scale of the change that's required in the future to upkeep our properties in line with better energy efficiency. And ultimately, what the committee have drafted in the subclause 6 around requiring consultation with departments, council, landlords and stakeholders, I wholeheartedly support that. I think before any legislation could even be considered to be introduced, there's a huge piece of work needs to be done to fully understand the scale of work that's required. And ultimately, it goes without saying, financial incentives for landlords are going to be every bit as important as actually the introduction of the minimum standards from the tenant's perspective. So there is a significant cost to that, and that is one of those which I highlight could significantly detract landlords from staying in the sector if there were to be hit by a pending cost. In terms of Clause 10, the electrical safety standards regulation, I fully support this view again, but I'm not in any way an electrician. I haven't done any research into this to know what the appropriate length of time should be, so whether it should be 5-year period or not. What I would suggest as well is, just to open the minds to a different perspective again, the landlord has to renew their landlord registration scheme every 3 years. Could this be something, if the committee thought it needed to be brought forward, could it be brought into whenever it's done at the time of renewal, or a biannual renewal, or sorry, bi-renewal every 6 years if you felt that was more appropriate? And the final thing, which I've only thought about over the weekend there, so it's maybe isn't included in the pack, if you really wanted to incentivise longer term tenancies, could it be the case that you would have to have an electrical safety regulation check every time there's a new tenant moving into the property? That would certainly be an incentive to keep longer term tenancies there. In terms of clause 11, to amend the notice to quit period from 4 weeks to 2 months, fully support this view. I mean, our data suggests that pre-COVID, it took around 40 days or so to find and agree a rental property, and then on top of that, you clearly have your moving time and the logistics. So I think 2 months is the minimum that would be required. The alternative, which I did think, which could potentially be implemented, would be a banded scheme, such as you have a 1 month notice to quit for every 6 months of a tenancy period. So 1 month if you had a 6 month lease, you had 2 months if you had a 12-month lease, and 3 months if you had an 18-month lease. And you could obviously implement a floor and ceiling of maybe 1 and 3 months there, but obviously that incentivises a longer notice period for people who are in longer term tenancies. One of the concerns I did have with changing the notice to quit period was, would landlords potentially charge double rent or a higher deposit to compensate for a potential period of lost income? So I think it's imperative that that will be covered through clause 4, limiting the deposit and the introduction of the rent amounts. One of the final points in this was, and I've included more evidence in the later stages of your pack, the Housing Executives Landlord Survey highlighted around 70% of landlords offered an initial term of 12 months. However, a further 61% would be encouraged to offer longer term tenancies if it became easier, and they quoted as the #1 reason, to remove problem tenants. So by the same principle of what I mentioned earlier, could a provision be introduced as a mechanism to allow landlords to challenge and justify if they do have an example of problem tenants, which would allow them to expedite the notice to quit period, perhaps earlier than the legislative requirement? And then in final remarks, which are kind of tangentially linked to the bill, ultimately, I think with any change in legislation, communication is absolutely key. So how can this bill and any amendments to it be actually transparently communicated to tenants? And as an open invitation, what role can property advertisement sites such as Property Pal play in improving the accessibility of that information? And I've suggested this an example, could it be a mandatory requirement for all the tenancy rights to be displayed on every property advertisement on the site? So we have to change our structure so that it directly links, whether that is to a Department for Communities section, with all the changes to the bill and what the tenancy rights are there and then, which could also be provided in their tenancy pack. And the very final point I wanted to make was around the Landlord Registration scheme. Now, as it stands, anyone can check the Landlord Registration scheme based on an individual property search or an individual landlord's name search. But the problem with that is there's no way to have a bulk download of all of that information, because one of the things we would like to implement is on every property advertisement, we can then cross-check it with that Landlord Registration scheme to make sure the rental property has a registered landlord and how long the period left on that registration scheme is for that landlord, so as the tenant understands the position going into that. And it would also simply allow the council authorities to play an active role ensuring all rented accommodation in your jurisdiction are appropriately registered. But the problem with that at the minute is it's on an individual search basis, and given we're adding between 15 and 20,000 rental properties a year, it's not possible to do that as a manual exercise. So hopefully there will be a simple amendment there which would allow that, which again would then improve the upfront information for the tenant. That's everything. I'm happy to take some questions at that stage. Thank you.
Okay, Jordan, look, thank you very much for a very detailed briefing paper and also briefing. You've raised many issues, some of concern and some that we're going to have to ask the department to clarify. It is worrying here in Northern Ireland that we do have that, where private rented sector certainly is used more and more. Not least because of our lack of social housing and the fact that our young people can't get onto the property ladder because of the deposits and the way that's working. So we know we have an over-reliance on the private rented sector. It is worrying. It said earlier on in your evidence about, I think you put it as further detract landlords from the sector. And that's whenever we look at any bill, we look at unintended consequences, and that's certainly one of the unintended consequences that we need to be very wary of. Could you maybe, Jordan, just give us a bit more information around that? What way do you see that projecting into the future if this bill is as drafted, without maybe some necessary amendments, and anything that you can, any amendments you might see that would help with that, to keeping those homes within the private rented sector?
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly what I tried to do. I mean, clearly, as I said, the bill in its current format has tenants at the heart, which is absolutely the right thing, because change is needed to improve the arrangements for them specifically. But as I said, given the strength of the current market conditions, we've already started to see landlords move out of the sector. And whenever you look at the most recent survey there, which is included in that from the Housing Executive on their landlord survey, the biggest barrier to them going forward, which would make them leave, is either strong market conditions or increased regulation. Now clearly we're seeing the latter of that at the minute, and this is going to increase the former to them. So what I would suggest is, how can we bring landlords in to encourage them, or find out specifically from them what are the potential regulation changes which would be most problematic for them. And if they do, for instance, say it's around the change in terms of that notice to quit period, then it's those little nuances that I've added in there. Is there some sort of mechanism we could introduce to allow a landlord to justify if they did have a problem tenant, then how they could move the notice to quit period earlier? So it's really it's trying to bring them into the question, to allow them to give their perspective, where maybe, we all know the understanding and the perception that landlords have, and that absolutely does exist in a lot of cases, but the reverse is also there, where there are good landlords and problem tenants. So it's finding that balance between giving them the option to try and work around the legislation, whilst obviously keeping it adhered to the central focus on the tenants.
And I suppose as a constituency MLA, we tend to come across the poor landlords more than the good landlords, because of the nature of the work that we do in our constituency offices. And we know that the vast majority of landlords are good landlords, and we want to support them as well as the renters. But as I say, I mean, with some horrors, every one of us could tell you a horror story in this room about a private rental that we have had cause to visit, where I think it probably very much falls into the clause 9 and that part of it, where you have had poor heating systems and poor energy efficiency, which actually just puts more of a burden on the renter. So it does. So just again, whenever we look at that, and I know you'd said possibly the most critical part of the bill was clause 9. And then I suppose just to ask you then, if landlords are asked to bring up properties to a certain standard, then that, in your opinion, would that have then a knock-on effect on the price of rentals as well, because they're going to want to recoup that money back? And also very interesting what you were saying there about the rent increases as well. I mean, is that another unintended consequence of the bill? I know my daughter has lived in private rental for 3 years, and there's never been a rent increase, and she's quite happy there, and so's the owner. So is that going to be an unintended consequence, where we might then say, well, landlords take that as that I have to do a rent increase every 12 year, or every year, and then because of the work that needs carried out, it's just again, are they unintended consequences for the renter?
Yeah, it absolutely is. I mean, I've kind of 2 points on that. I mean, even if you take sort of a typical example, the average rent in Northern Ireland of around sort of £700 a month there, you factor that in over a year and then net off any taxes, you're maybe talking about a net there of around sort of £4,500–5,000 of income for that year's rent for the landlord. And whenever you factor in the average cost to raise from an EPC-D rating to EPC-C is around £6,000, that in itself is like a year worth of income gone just to improve the property, which a lot of landlords, who are the smaller, sort of your accidental landlords, if you will, do not have that income sitting aside just to put into that. So there needs to be creative thinking there in terms of sort of low-cost loans to incentivise landlords to do that in a way which then just won't lead to significant rent increases as they pass that through to the tenant. Now, that being said, the other bit at the minute, which there's a lot of misinformation around what actually the impact of improving property EPC ratings has on the material value or the capital value of the property itself. And as you said, there's no real clarity at the minute of how surveyors and lenders are valuing properties, because should we move into a position in sort of 3-5 years' time where there is a much greater emphasis put on the EPC rating and the corresponding value that has on the overall property, then at that stage the landlord may not need to pass on the rent because they'll experience it through greater improvement in the capital value of the property, if you follow what I mean by that. But at the minute that isn't the case, and there's no real evidence to suggest there's a significant premium for properties which do have this better EPC rating. So in the short term, as things currently stand, I struggle to see a scenario where a landlord would have to put significant cost to renovate the property to improve the EPC rating without having to pass that through in significantly higher rent. So yes, I do believe that could be a considerable unintended consequence.
And I suppose if you look at even to get a new boiler put in, which is more energy efficient and everything else, you're talking at least £3,000. And whenever you talk about income, that is a massive part of the income of the landlord as well. So that will be reflected then in the rent. No, look, that's grand. Thank you for that, Jordan. I'm going to open it up to the meeting at this stage. Kelly, I know you had indicated. Anybody else want to come in? Can they let me know?
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Jordan. As always, invaluable presentation. I wanted to go back to your comments on Clause 9 first, if I could. You've certainly have said to us that the pre-legislation preparation does need to be done to consider what energy performance certificates, what the requirements will be. I'm just looking to pick your brain on this. With regards to England and Wales, do you know of any actions that they put in place to help fund private landlords to help them reach the ratings, or was there a grant available to help upscale private tenancies? Was there anything like that brought forward? Because it'd be important for us perhaps to reference this in our report going back.
Yes, there is. I'm trying to remember off the top of my head, and if I don't, I've written this down in a few places so I can send it into the committee thereafter if that would be helpful. But there was certainly grants available for upkeep. There was maximum sort of cost ceilings that landlords had to invest in the property, and other introductions like that to try and mitigate the direct financial impact on landlords as a result. But from a broader perspective, I feel there needs to be a much bigger piece for the state intervention here around having access to a pool of low-cost loans at low, if not flat, interest rates to incentivise both homeowners and private landlords to invest in their property for the longer-term potential of it. Because at the end of the day, I don't think, whilst we clearly have a lot of work ongoing around the climate agenda and the green housing agenda, I think it's going to take a lot more than suggesting to people, you could save £200 a year on your bills as a result of this introduction. That barrier up front of what we say is truly, it's a minimum of sort of £5,000, £6,000, £7,000 of investment. That's going to take years, if not decades, in the monthly savings alone to accrue that back. So there needs to be an initial upfront support there from a pool of funds to encourage that shift, rather than just keeping this delayed.
And I was just wondering, if you are sending information into the committee, I would really appreciate if there was any criteria attached to those loans. So say, for instance, the landlord then couldn't sell off the property within X period of time of having that uplift, that tenant or that premises, being able to meet EPC ratings, and then getting the benefit of that and then selling off the property.
No problem. I'll have a look at that and try and pull something across and send it through to you this afternoon.
Yeah, I'm just checking at the minute as well. Having looked at the Landlord Register, I'm assuming now that register is updated and maintained by the Department of Communities. In the future rollout of this legislation, there appears to be a much bigger role for councils. Do you envisage the register moving to councils, or will that be centrally held, do you think, by communities, with councils then updating details?
Truthfully, I don't know the answer to that there. What I was trying to explain was that it's kind of one of those loopholes where I can do an individual search, but I can't do a bulk search, which then creates a barrier for the likes of ourselves who want to make that information freely available. But it's one of those frustrations where you can't work around the existing technical systems. I think councils certainly have a big role to play in that, but I don't know who would be responsible for holding that central register. But I do think there's something to be said about looking at that to try and improve. And one of the other comments I would make as well, I was doing some examples last night just to try and find it. It's very clunky to use, particularly if you're searching for apartments, because they tend to be in blocks. So whenever, if I wanted to search for, unit, for example, 2C of apartment block A, it's very difficult to actually find that on the register. So I don't know whether it's set up and equipped in such a way that you can easily extract that unit out of it. And I mean, for example, as if I were to be a tenant looking for that, that's a barrier put in front of me on the very starting point, just to find out if this property has a tenant. So I think there's quick fixes could be done there to just try and help the tenant with better information up front.
Absolutely agree with you. One of the frustrations that I had with it was when you looked up, say for instance, the landlord's name, you just got the reference number, but you didn't get the list of the properties that they own. So if you're a council, say for instance, Ards and North Downborough Council that is one of my council areas, but the landlord actually has properties in Belfast or Mid-Ulster or wherever that may be, unless you're in constant communication with your counterparts in other councils, how do you know if that landlord has defaulted on a rental deposit scheme or, meeting electricity standards or whatever across the country? So there's something there. The information is there. It's just how you access it on that site is difficult.
Completely agree.
Yeah, no, John, that's all I have for you. Jordan, thank you very much. As always, as I said at the start, absolutely brilliant to see this sort of information coming through, and it certainly helps me, going forward with the bill. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Kelly. Paul?
Thank you, Chair, and thanks very much for your presentation. Very, very good and detailed. Can I take you through just some of the concerns I have that you then have raised in your response? First of all, the Clause 3 piece with regards to the rent receipt for payments in cash. In your experience, how many landlords actually do not offer a choice of payment and it's only cash? Because it strikes me as that being unfair, that you aren't giving your tenants a choice of payment other than cash, and then that, of course, leads to all sorts of problems and dilemmas and transparency issues further on down the line. How big an issue is that?
In truth, I can only speak anecdotally. I'm not on the front ground enough to know the extent to which this happens. I mean, my understanding is a lot of cases, from conversations with letting agents, is in the most part it actually works. Most pay by backs, and there's no issue there, and there is a digital or electronic trail of that. But again, we've all heard the stories again where there are people who paid by cash and they're not given receipt, and then it's questioned whether or not they paid. So it's just whether it's common or not, or whether we're working at a legislation to address the minority here. It seems like it just needs to be implemented to remove any ambiguity there and keep it as a consistent playing field. Yeah. It strikes me, I think we need to be doing something about the choice the option, to be honest with you. But I do agree with you with regards to it should be for all cash payments, just not rent payments. That just strikes me as being really just sensible. So I do think we'll probably have to look to looking at exploring changes there. There's I don't know if you have the bill in front of you. In Clause 3, there is let me read this bill. Clause 3. Paragraph 4. It's 3B. The receipt must be provided, if that is not possible, as soon as reasonably possible after that time. Where do you think there'll be an occasion whereby someone is handing over cash, but the recipient of that cash hasn't been or won't be able to give a receipt? It just strikes me that cash should not be handed over until there is a fair exchange of receipt. Absolutely. I mean, I think that's it in itself. The tenant should not hand over any cash unless the landlord is in a position to give them a receipt there and then. Yeah. And if it's a position where the landlord's saying, "Look, I don't have a piece of paper, I can't sign this," or whatever it is, then either the tenant doesn't give it, or what I've suggested there was, how can we understand what a receipt is? Is a WhatsApp message from your landlord saying that, or if they could sign a scribble on a napkin there and then say, "I've received on X date." Mm-hmm. Just how do we define that receipt if you are going to experience that position, where the landlord just calls to the house and demands the payment, and they have to pay there and then, but he isn't able to provide it? Is there a workaround that could be quickly made, just as that digital receipt that I've suggested? Yeah. My thinking is still very primitive on this bill, but I'm moving towards
considering the removal of that 3B. Paragraph 4 of that same clause, a tenant must not be required to make a payment in respect of the provision of a receipt. Do you know what that means? Because I don't. A tenant must not be required to make a payment in respect of the provision of the receipt. So does that mean that if someone produces a receipt, then payment must be made? Or am I completely wrong in that? And do you have any understanding of that?
I read it as kind of how you've described there. If there is a payment to be made for something associated with that property, which was obviously resulting from the tenant, and it's their responsibility to pay for it, then they have to do so, but that receipt should be provided there and then as well.
Yeah.
That's how I understood. But again, even that, the fact we have to debate the understanding of that just means it's open to being exposed and interpreted differently, because if we don't fully understand it, it's going to be difficult for the tenant and the landlord to then manipulate that. Yeah,
we'll put the department on notice that we'd probably want a clarification of that, to be honest with you. I know they'll be listening in. With regards to the frequency of rent increases, I get what you're saying with regards to the stipulation of 12 months. Once you put that into train, that nearly becomes an habitual move. But personal experience tells me that, see, if you get a good tenant, they're actually worth their weight in gold, and far greater worth than a rent increase. They really are. So you would forgo that if you're trying to secure a tenancy in place to look after your property, basically. So yeah, I do think that I would worry about having that stipulation. It does say, interestingly enough, on that clause with regards to rent increases, that there's a paragraph, subsection paragraph 3, the department may by regulation specify circumstances in which paragraph 2 does not apply, and paragraph 2 basically is the stipulation of the 12 months. Do you know of any regulations any circumstances that would necessitate paragraph 2 not being in play? Is that...
No, I don't. I mean, that's kind of what I've introduced in the point there. Do we need to introduce provision to include a mechanism to allow the landlord to justify any rent increases, maybe beyond, say, a month 9 or whatever it would be if it was a 12-month period? That was kind of, I felt, almost implemented through that. It kind of implied there was an exemption in place there to omit that 12-month period. So it was kind of just giving me a wee bit of an alarm bell that there was already a mechanism in place, but I wasn't sure about what the justification process for that is. So that's where I was bringing in, do we need to have something, evidence there, around in terms of additional cost to the landlord as a result of a renovation, or bringing in a comparable market rent analysis to show that it is a fair value based on whatever that amendment has been.
And it may be that the department is just trying to cover all fields with that clause, and it's a very general thing, but again, generalism is not really necessarily great on a bill, so we'll need to explore that with the department too. I take your point with regards to justification for rent increases. Now, a year is a relatively short period of time, so even if you knew you were renegotiating your mortgage as a landlord, and you ended up with a worse deal and more payments to be made, which could necessitate then you struggling and needing to increase the rent. But surely there'll come a time when you'll be able to do that, even if it is 12 months down the line. And then, I suppose, 12 months down the line, you'd actually cater for the increase and the time duration that you've already paid that increase. So, if you like, it would nearly level itself out after a period of time. So, even if you did start to pay a horrendously higher mortgage, the worst you're going to have paying for is the 12 months at the most, and then you can increase the rent accordingly. Surely that's fair enough duration of time.
Yeah, I don't disagree with what you're saying. It was more just because we don't know what the pass-on payment would be. So if they have to endure that 12-month period of just get on with it and what it is, and then once you get to the end of that, then look, I incurred suddenly an additional £500–600 in mortgage costs last year as a result. So what I'm going to do is increase the rent this year with an inflationary rise and an additional amount to incur that lost revenue back. So then it would it's almost like a double rent increase, if you will, at the end of that period. So it's kind of just to highlight the potential for that to happen. So that's why I was bringing in, like everything, like property sales, if you have comparable rent analysis to show that it's not out of kilter with prevailing market conditions at the time.
Clause 9, the energy efficiency stuff. You'll probably know this as well as we do. Some of the housing executive stock is in really bad disrepair, especially around heating systems. And then what happens with the housing executive stock is that they put you onto a scheme, which then is delayed for years. So even if you've been promised a boiler replacement or even maintenance around your house, either external or internal, and it's earmarked for the end of the year, chances are it's going to be the end of 3 years. And that's how the housing executive operate. So, whilst I understand the housing stock is getting worse, even in the private rented sector, it's also true to say that in the public sector. So I suppose, do we need to be careful of what stipulations and pressures we apply to private landlords that could end up having unintended consequences, and let the housing executive have a freer rein whenever both parties, both private landlords and housing executive, are producing housing stock that we desperately need?
Yes, again, I think there does need to be a joined-up strategy here across public, social and private housing needs there. I mean, this whole green space it's going to change everything in housing in the next decade, and having different timeframes for different bodies just adds to confusion. So I would certainly try and bring that joined-up strategy together there about the whole retrofit, but then you've got to bring in the wider perspective there about ensuring we have the skills and the talent pool across our construction industry to then do that as well. So if the introduction is said, for new tenancies by 2025 or and existing tenancies by 2028, there's also then factoring in the disruption to the tenant at the time if there is significant works required in the property. So it was a bit of a get out of jail clause one for me on this as well, because basically this is a huge piece of work to do this across the board, and I don't think it could be rushed. And this needs consultation with all of these groups representing the tenant, the landlord voice, but importantly even the construction and the contractors and the universities, and ensuring we have the pipeline of talent there to facilitate this green movement in housing. It cannot be overlooked as a really significant feature over the next decade.
Yeah. Just the last point, final point then on the electrical safety, declaring interest as an approved electrician. I like the point you make about the buy renewal of landlord registration, because I simply think if the landlord registration renewal is every 3 years, 3 years is probably too soon for electrical installation testing. Whenever in a private house, owner occupied, I think it's, I could be wrong, but I think it's maybe a decade or something of that nature before So whilst I know that with a rented sector you probably need to be more articulate and more testing regime, I get that. I think the buy renewal of landlord registration really strikes a chord with me. So it's every other time you're registering, and that probably would be fair. But the point I make, and I make it every week, is it's not necessarily the electrical installation that you need to keep an eye on. It's the portable equipment that's plugged into that installation, which has probably more fear for me, both on a tenant side and a landlord side and a tenant side. So it's the portable equipment and the testing regime around that. And I think that's not necessarily the burden or the full responsibility or the full burden on the landlord, whenever there's so much portable equipment would be owned by and used by the tenant. Have you any views on that? I know you said you weren't an electrician, I get that, I know that, but have you any views on the portable equipment, the PAT testing as they call it?
Yeah. Yeah, so in terms of the first point there, I mean, as I said, I don't know whether 3, 5, 6, 10 years is appropriate. There needs to be expert advice sought for that there. But I like even the idea of during the renewal of the landlord registration or the buy renewal, because even going back to what Kelly mentioned earlier, you could bring that into a central database then and have all the information up front, and it's much easier to track then. Very simple, you don't get your registration if you don't have your electrical safety approval. So that just fitted me as a natural link and cohesion there. In terms of the point you raised around PAT testing, I mean, I certainly think, from the landlord's perspective, if they're providing a property to a tenant, then it is their responsibility at the outset to make sure that all electrical safety standard is working effectively. So they should do that, albeit with the time frame there as the caveat. The PAT testing one, it's a really interesting concept, and truthfully, I do not know what the correct answer to that is, because clearly that is an additional cost to tenants who are already being squeezed financially as a result of these pressures. So my inclination is that no, that shouldn't be a requirement. It should be encouraged for tenants to do that, and there could potentially be some sort of scheme of approved contractors that they have to go to that. But it should not be a mandatory requirement for them to do that, but to enter the premises, and they need to be aware that it is approved safety standard from the electrical perspective.
Okay, thank you very much for your time and your answers. Thank you.
Thanks, Paul. Anybody else want to ask anything of Jordan? No? Okay. Look, Jordan, thank you so much for coming in today. As Kelly said, really, really great briefing. Yeah, we know we can rely on you going forward for any other information that we need as well. So thanks,
No
Jordan.
problem.
Sorry, can I come in one
Sorry,
more?
Paul wants to come back at you about something.
I drew a scribble on the front of this bill. Do you any views on letting agent fees and regulations around that? And it's not in the bill, but we've been hearing that it should be in the bill in some quarters. With regards to increased checks on landlords when they register, increased fitness standards, more ways to resolve disputes between tenants and landlords. Does some like your organisation have a role to play, and maybe even a responsibility to play with regards to things like that, with regards to letting agents? Should there be something in here about letting agents?
Potentially, is the truth. Again, it's very hard to say whether there should or shouldn't. It would depend on the nature of what would be included in it. Could our organisation play a remit in that? Well, I mean, as a central point between consumers and letting agents, yes, we absolutely could play a link there where we don't have a particular interest to one group more than the other. So there is merit in exploring it, but it would, like everything, it would depend on absolutely the detail of what you're trying to include in it.
Okay, thank you very much, sir. Thank you.
Great. Look, thank you, Jordan, for your time with us today.
No problem. Thank you all so much. Good luck.
Thank you. Okay, members, we're going to move on to agenda item 6, the UK Collaborative Centre for Housing Evidence Briefing on the Private Tenancies Bill. Members, we were due to be briefed by Cash at today's meeting, but they've advised they're no longer available. So their briefing paper is at page 59 for you to note. Then we're going to move on to agenda item 7, which is the...
Chair,
Sorry?
will they be available at a future date?
Will they be available to us? Do we know? First of all,
If you wish us to pursue them, but it may be a struggle to actually slot them into our very packed timetable, but if you really wish us to...
I thought the paper was quite interesting, good experience we could perhaps draw on.
Okay, we
but
can go back
we
to
can
them,
go back
yeah.
and ask them. Yeah, no, that's fair enough. That's okay. All right, we'll move on to agenda item 7, which is the National Union of Students NI briefing on the Private Tenancies Bill. You'll find this paper at page 65 of your packs. And then can I welcome Ellen Fearon to the meeting today? Ellen, there we go. Ellen, good to see you. Hope you're keeping well. We can't hear you, Ellen. Give us, try talking again. Still can't hear Ellen. Hold on, Ellen, one moment. Do you know where it's coming from? So she's unmuted this end, and you're unmuted your end, Ellen. Yeah, okay. Hold on, just bear with us 2 ticks. It wouldn't be our committee if we didn't have an issue, so don't be worrying too
Maybe
much
she
about
could
it
go
here.
out. She could just go out and try coming back in.
Yeah, Ellen, could you try leaving the meeting and coming back in again, and we'll see if that works? Thank you. Brilliant, thank you. Okay, members, just take your ease for a wee moment while we wait for that.
Chair, I'd like to just give apologies to Aisling Riley.
Okay,
Today
I
she's
saw
having,
Ashley had popped up. And
she's having technical
Yeah, she
difficulties.
just emailed me there.
So she is.
Okay, thank
There's
you.
Ellen back.
Okay, there's Ellen back. Now, let's see if we can hear her now. Go ahead and start speaking now. No, we still can't hear her. Okay.
Wonder if you click on your microphone, Ellen. Turn it up.
Okay, right, what are we going to do here? This is just, it's not the first time this has happened.
our end.
So it's not, so we'll not, yeah.
Dialing.
I wonder, could you dial, do you want, yeah, you could try dialing in. Do you mind dialing in, Ellen, if you have access to a phone? We'll not see your face, but we'll hear you. Want to try it? Great, okay. No other business on even after this, members, that I can zoom on to. But so we'll just take your ease. We'll just wait. I've met Ellen before at other events, and she's very knowledgeable. That's maybe her now. Hi, Ellen, can you hear us?
Yes, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
I can indeed. That's brilliant. Thank you, Ellen, for doing that. You're
No worries.
You're
I'm
very.
sorry about that.
You're all right. We have technical difficulties every week, and I think all committees do. So this is nothing unusual for us. Can I thank you for coming to brief the committee today, Ellen? And if you want to go ahead and start your briefing.
Yes, perfect. Thank you so much, and thank you so much for having me. Yeah, I suppose to jump in, obviously housing is one of the key issues impacting student populations. You'll have our consultation response in your papers to the bill, which provides more in-depth information on each clause of the bill. So during my presentation, I'm going to address the main challenges students face around housing, the main challenges being supply, affordability and quality. So I suppose to briefly consider each in turn. In terms of supply, we know that typically Northern Ireland students have been more fortunate than other students on this island in that housing has generally been more readily available, and although still unaffordable when compared to what is offered by student finance, at least it's set at a lower rate than the rents we see elsewhere. However, this is changing, and in the last few months we've seen a change quite drastically. So while much of the bill we're discussing today considers quality of housing and rental protection, it's important to consider the pressure on supply, because for us that means that the supply pressure is often what forces student tenants into accepting poor conditions and being unwilling to maybe upset a landlord for fear of eviction. Property Pals has estimated that there's been a drop of 51% of available rental properties compared to 2019. Homeless has estimated that Northern Ireland has seen an increase of 11.6% in average rental value since October 2021 compared to the same period last year. I suppose that's a bit of a case study on this. One Ulster University student has told us, I've been trying to get a house since March. Originally we were looking for 4 people. That went down to 2 around June time due to the lack of HMO housing. I was working in the city centre in a retail job I absolutely loved. Over the summer, my housemate and I viewed no less than 15 or so houses, and to date it may be 30 plus houses. No one will accept me. Most letting agents will not reply with reasoning, and they won't tell me if I've been denied or accepted. Many people ask me to apply who are only in full-time employment, and they will not accept any students. At the end of August, I had to place myself on sick leave from my job, and by 2 weeks into the month, I had to quit as there was simply no housing available. My current commute sees me travelling an hour plus each way with close to 100 miles a day. I've been displaced from the place I've lived for almost 4 years. There are many students who have been left in that position this year, and according to Queen's Students' Union, the main types of students that they're currently supporting are actually international students with families who have arrived with their children and ended up with nowhere to live. While preparing this presentation, we were told by the union that in the last week, 3 to 4 students have contacted them to tell them that they're going to have to drop out of their course and return to their home country if they can't find accommodation here. I suppose when it comes to affordability and the issues we face there, students in Northern Ireland have access to the lowest levels of student finance in the UK. Grants, loans and bursaries in both higher and further education have not increased with inflation for about 10 years, meaning that students today are roughly 20% worse off than their counterparts were 1 decade ago. Many students supplement their income with part-time work, and the Ulster Bank Student Living Index has found that students in Northern Ireland work the second highest hours across the UK. That can have serious mental and physical health implications, as many students are working long hours on top of studying full-time courses in order to survive. So in this context, it's really easy to see why rent can place a significant financial burden on students. In our paper, we've outlined several figures outlining the high proportion of student income which goes on rent payment and the high numbers of students who experience continuous worries about meeting their basic living expenses. So with rent costs across Northern Ireland rising substantially and student finance still not rising with inflation, and to match those rents increasing, the pressure students are under when it comes to renting and affordability on renting is likely to continue and get worse. Lastly, I suppose in terms of quality, student housing, as we all know, and poor quality housing are so synonymous that it's almost become a bit of a running joke, and something that many people think they simply have to accept when they move into student housing. Very often students live in houses owned by landlords who rent to students year on year, meaning that they don't have to develop a long-term relationship with their tenants. They can more or less be guaranteed that their houses will be filled and that their tenants will be fairly new to renting and may not be fully informed of their rental rights. But what's more is that most students don't have a good understanding of the mechanisms available to them if they complain if they're having problems with their landlord. And if they're on short-term fixed tenancy, they may decide that the effort of fighting their landlord is simply not worth it. In recent months, we've heard the story of a student who had a leak that the landlord didn't get repaired for some time, which resulted in a damp and mould. When they did fix it, it was done in the most economical way possible rather than the correct way, and the leak returned and the same thing happened again and again. We've heard from a student paying for a furnished property who had a broken bed frame and mattress which was unable to be slept on. The landlord simply refused to replace these items and the issue took several months to be resolved. I'm speaking from personal experience. I've been through it all myself. I've had mice in my student housing. I've had the room in my kitchen caved in the middle of the night and it rained in our apartment for 8 hours. I've had a landlord refuse to fix our front lock on our front door, which resulted in a man walking in and me sleeping in the middle of the night, which was beyond terrifying, and so many more stories like that. We've also recently ran a campaign, a Student House of Horrors campaign, which has hundreds and hundreds of students, student stories which are quite similar. And those issues cause significant stress to students who usually don't have the financial means to try and move on to resolve housing problems themselves. So I suppose the overall point of the presentation is to say that supply, affordability and quality are and have been for some time the most prominent challenges that students face when it comes to student housing. You'll see in our consultation response a lot of the issues addressed by this bill are very positive, particularly for low-income student tenants who deal with insecure and inadequate housing the most, but the bill simply doesn't go far enough to tackle any of these issues very extensively, so it's a welcome first step, but we definitely need to see more. And yes, I'm happy to take any questions from the committee.
That's brilliant, Ellen. Thank you so much. And we are fully aware that when it comes to student housing, it's another level of issues that you and your cohort face. It is a bit scary. I think you'd said it there that guaranteed these houses will be filled, so there really isn't that pressure put on landlords to have housing that is fit for people to live in. you raised a couple of issues. Interesting that almost 30% of student renters are asked to pay a deposit before they've even seen their tenancy agreement. You also brought up the issue about international students maybe not having a bank account, so therefore they are paying in cash as well, and various other issues that you've raised. Just to ask you, Ellen, have you any ideas of what amendments that we could possibly put forward and look at just to make to help with the many issues that student renters face?
Yeah, to be honest, I'd be happy to send over something that lays this out a wee bit more, but I suppose there's a range of things that aren't covered in the bill that we'd like to see. The first thing is definitely when it comes to evictions, they would suggest that there would be a 4-week eviction period for those who are on a lease of a year or less, and that is students really. That it's very rare for a student to have a tenancy agreement for more than a year, so we would like to see that extended to 12 weeks. In line with current emergency legislation. In terms of rent increases, I think the bill fails to provide any restriction on the level of rent increases a landlord can implement. So while it's welcome that there's a limit on the rent increases only once in a 12-month period, there's no limit on how much that rent can actually increase, and that's something that is really worrying that we'd like to see. We'd also like to see more measures put in place, not only to, I suppose, limit the deposit paid by a renter to 1 month's rent, but limit the amount of rent which can be charged in advance. Often students, particularly international students, are asked for 3-4 months' rent up front, so that is something that we'd like to see included. I suppose there is a list of things included in the briefing, so if it's helpful, I'm happy to sort of lay out in maybe some more information to you on what exactly some steps we'd like to see.
Absolutely, Ellen. Look, we would really appreciate that if you could do that for us, because we do want to help. We do want to make things better for students as well, and for all renters. So certainly we would want to help with that. I know, and it's talking about something a wee bit different here, that we do have the Hmo legislation. I sat in this committee several years ago when we looked at HMO legislation. How is it working for students? Just to ask on the side, how's that working?
To be honest, I'm not too sure. I don't think much has changed for student renters with the introduction of that legislation. I don't think we've seen many improvements. But again, to be honest, I don't have the information available to me in terms of even anecdotal evidence to really answer that. But again, I'd be happy to get back to you on that. But I think overall, like, student renters haven't seen any positive changes in the last few decades. Things really are only getting worse, and we've really seen that in the past 4 months, even with sort of the lack of supply and rent increases in particular.
No, look, thanks for that. And I know it wasn't part of this briefing, but it just would be interesting to know. And I think you made a very good point about the notice to quit, because, as you say, many of those student renters will not have that full 12 months. So I think that there's issues there around protection for them as well that I hadn't taken into account. So thank you for that also. I'm going to open up to the floor of Kelly, and anybody else want to ask, can they let me know? Go ahead, Kelly.
Ellen, thank you very much for your presentation. I'll declare an interest at this stage as a mum of a student who's currently living in student accommodation, but also as a person who lived in some dumps in my time when I was a student, but it doesn't sound as if it's got too much better whenever you couldn't open your kitchen cupboard because it was just full of black mould. But Ellen, just to pick your brains on a few things, out of your research that you guys are doing, could I just check, what is the average length of contract that students have at this stage? Is it still 12 months, or are landlords pushing it to 56 weeks or more?
It would still be 12 months. In the private sector, it's usually 38 weeks for purpose-built, but no, it's definitely more often than not, it'll still be a 12-month lease.
And just from what you've known so far, is there any availability for landlords to extend by a month-by-month contract? I'm thinking in particular of something that you brought up, where students are being asked to leave at a time when they're going through exams and the end of their year of study.
To be honest, it's very rare. The way that student housing normally works is that, for example, if a student starts their lease in August by February time, landlords will want to know who is taking over that house next and if they're staying, and they'll want to have that concrete by March time. So at that stage, like 6 months before a student even leaves, they'll have to sign on to that lease again or declare that they are leaving. So there's usually very, very little room for students to extend their lease by a month or two.
So that was what my next question was going to lead on to. So even if students are lucky enough, and I did this between my first and second year, I stayed in the same house. Thankfully, I had a good landlord in that house. Sadly, I left in third year and went into a dump. But I'm just wondering, where a student wants to increase that contract by a further 12 months, are you saying then that the landlord is asking for another deposit?
Yes, exactly. So, if they're staying in the house, usually the deposit will just carry over into the next tenancy agreement. I suppose the issue there arises if a student does leave that tenancy and has to sign up to another tenancy, say 6 months before they've left their current one, then they're paying a deposit and rent in 1 month, which on the sort of current levels of student finance has been really problematic.
Okay, and just on that deposit return, I know when I was a student, and I dread to think it may happen again with my daughter, but deposits were like hen's teeth to get back. Just from the research that you guys have done, are you seeing deposits being returned, or is it the same thing where every excuse under the sun not to have a deposit returned?
Yeah, you probably won't be surprised to hear not much has really changed there. It is incredibly difficult to get your deposit back as a student, and I think again that largely comes down to there is a bit of a power imbalance there where students maybe don't know their rights, and also because they're on such short-term contracts, they are a bit afraid to challenge landlords. But like I got £100 taken off me in my deposit 1 year because I forgot to brush under my bed. Like stuff like that is so common. Again, also there are a huge amount of properties where landlords don't actually register the deposit under the tenancy deposit scheme, and students again aren't really aware sometimes that that's meant to happen. So I think it is both an awareness problem and also, again, landlords sometimes will do anything under the sun not to give a full deposit back.
And just thinking about that, as part of this legislation, there's a proposal that any rent that is paid would have a receipt. If any rent, paid in cash would have a receipt. What we're thinking about possibly moving to is any cash payments would have a receipt. Am I right in thinking that a lot of these deposits are being paid in cash?
Yeah, I think it's quite likely if rent is being paid in cash, then the deposit on the same sort of tenancy agreement will be cash as well. So yeah, we would be supportive of that, and for a receipt to have to be given.
Okay, and just finally, thank you very much for your answers, but I'm just thinking about the communications. How aware, now I'm thinking, say a first year goes into university, a student, whether it's further education, college or university, so they're heading off. How aware does the universities or the students' unions make student tenants aware of the Landlord Register, or support for students? And even after first year, is there something that needs to be done with communication to make sure that your rights, that you know your rights as a renter?
Yeah, absolutely. We would be very supportive of, I suppose, the department and universities looking into running a public information campaign around student renters and their rights. I know we've included some research in the past, but for example, over 57% of student renters feel that they know where to seek advice on their housing issues, which means that 43% have no idea. And I think that sometimes mechanisms to report housing problems aren't very clear and easily accessible. And particularly, again, students are a very unique cohort when they're moving maybe to university for the first time. They're also starting university for the first time. There's so many massive changes in their life that they have to get used to, and so many different things to be aware of. I think that definitely comes into it. So definitely we would be very supportive of a public information campaign, I suppose year long, because there is the sort of stage when students first sign up and have to pay their deposits, first sign into their tenancy agreements, and then the stage around February, March time when that happens again. And that really is where a lot of issues come up, when students are still in a tenancy agreement and having to sign on to a new one for 6 months' time. That's when we see a lot of problems arise. So definitely I think a lot more awareness is needed.
Okay, thank you very much. Ellen, just checking, this year, or this last 12 months, saw an enormous problem with student housing, especially in Belfast, with a lot of those students choosing to move into student, multiple accommodation, for instance, those high-rises that are particularly for students, will be moving out and trying to find properties across Belfast. Has there been any support for students through the Students' Union or from other bodies to alert people to the pressures that there will be about lack of student accommodation? And given the fact that this bill may well receive royal assent in advance of the next student year, has there been any talk about that through student unions or through your own union for students?
I suppose we currently run a campaign around student housing which brings light to a lot of these issues, but to be honest I think the responsibility there lies on the universities themselves who have such direct contact with students. I haven't seen too much of that at the minute, so those sort of, I suppose, awareness bits usually do come in second semester when students again are maybe looking for those houses and maybe stepping out of PBSAs for the first time. But to date, to be honest, I haven't seen much about it, and it's something that we're very worried about because we do see next year being a lot harsher even than this year, and the supply doesn't seem to be growing, especially for a lot of students. The choice isn't really there between purpose-built student accommodation and private student renting because the price difference is so drastic that a lot of students can't afford PBSs in the first place. So that's definitely an issue.
Oh no, thank you very much, Ellen. It doesn't sound like, I'll not tell you how many years it's been since I've been at university, but it doesn't sound like it has changed. Hopefully this legislation will make things somewhat better, especially the points that you've raised about people who have a 12-month contract. Thank you very much.
Okay, Kelly, thank you. Paul?
Thank you very much, Ellen, Chairperson Anne Ellen, for your presentation. Thank you. I wanted to ask you about Clause 11 on the requirements for notices to quit given by landlords and tenants. Because it strikes me that when I read Clause 11, it doesn't, and I could be wrong, I could be reading it wrong, but it doesn't seem to cater for 12 months and below. It seems to cater for 12 months and 10 years and everything in between, but not for 12 months and below. Is that your understanding?
I perhaps misspoke earlier. I think I had seen in the bill that there was maybe it was 12 months. That would be in terms of eviction a 4-week period, as opposed to 12 weeks. That part of the legislation may have been updated, but in any case, we would be very supportive of for any sort of eviction legislation for that to remain at 12 weeks.
12 weeks. Yeah, and that would seem reasonable, even though it is for under a year, because quite simply, an under a year tenancy is really only going to cater for students, not for anyone else. I'm talking in general sense there. I suppose there will be individual circumstances that are peculiar. So it strikes me, having listened to you and read your submission, that we may need to do something to cater for that cohort of people like yourself who are students. And it seems to be a blind spot in this bill. And we do know, as Kelly and the Chair has already alluded to, and I declare an interest as a father of a student who's living in accommodation in Belfast. I think the Chair's words were it's a different level altogether with regards to properties. So I get that, and I do think then that we need to cater for that in this bill and to afford some sort of protection for students with regards to secure tenancies, even though they may be in a property less than 12 months. I just think it strikes me as being reasonable. It's reasonable, first of all, that you would only have a 12-month tenancy agreement, which could be extended for further years depending on your studies. But it strikes me that it's common that you would have 12 months and then it needs to be catered for in this bill. That was more of a comment than a question, Ellen, but thanks very much for your presentation. Thank you.
Okay, Paul, anybody else want to ask anything of Ellen? No? No? Yes?
Not so much a question, Chair, just to concur with what Paul had says there around the shorter tenancies, that there are points that I think some of us had made in the debate in the Assembly. If not there, we've definitely made it in here at some stage. So it's good to know that we're on the same page as Ellen and the student unions on that. I think it's important that we do work together on this to get the best deal for our students and everyone out there availing of or being forced to avail of private rented accommodation.
Thanks, Mark. That's grand. Look, Ellen, thank you so much for your briefing and your very detailed briefing paper. If there's anything that you can send on to us to help us to shape this legislation better, to better protect students, please, Ellen, do forward it on to the committee clerk. It has really been another invaluable witness session, so thank you so much, Ellen, for your time today.
No worries. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
All right, members, that is us finished with our briefing sessions for today. I'm going to move on then to agenda item 8, on the wrong page. Agenda item 8, which is date, time and location of our next meeting. Members, our next meeting will take place on Thursday, the 11th of November 2021 at 9 a.m. in room 29. Thank you very much, members.
Committee room 30.